let's get started.
Good. Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to this event organized by the Department of Economic History and the Financial History Group. My name is Olivier Acominotti and I am a professor at the Department of Economic History. I am also the director of the newly created research group in financial history. Right? And it is a great pleasure to chair this event this evening, where we will discuss Oliver Volckart's new book, The Silver Empire, which appeared just a few months ago, I think in March, at Oxford University Press. Oliver is a well-known scholar at the LSE. He has been a professor of economic history since 2014, and he has been part of the Department of Economic History since 2007, if my records are correct. That's close to 20 years. He is also one of the world's greatest specialists in medieval and early modern monetary history. He has published dozens of journal articles and several books in English, but also in German, on this subject. And his research in particular has shed new light on how markets emerged in Central Europe in the premodern period, and also on the determinants of capital market integration in the pre-modern period. In all of his works, there is always a very strong emphasis on politics and institutions in shaping money markets and their integration, and in shaping monetary policies as well. And from that perspective, this book is Oliver at his best. It explores how Germany created a unified currency in the 16th century, well before the euro was created in the 20th century. But more generally, the book tells the story of how a serious coordination problem was overcome in the design of monetary policy, how this coordination problem was overcome in the context of a very complex political entity over a very large territory. So we have copies of the book available for purchase at a discount. So there is an arbitrage opportunity. I do not have to convince you to purchase the book, but let me nevertheless highlight two reasons why you should not only buy the book but also read it. So the first reason is that Oliver is a fantastic storyteller. Right? You don't have to be a specialist of early modern money or the politics of the Holy Roman Empire to enjoy this book, because it takes you by the hand. It tells you very concrete examples and anecdotes that make seemingly obscure and complex issues, such as the trade in coinage, the problems of bimetallism, the political organization of the Holy Roman Empire, look extremely clear and intuitive. And that makes it a very enjoyable book to read. And the second reason is that the book is also highly relevant to contemporary challenges. Collective action problems between governments are prevalent in the world today. For example, when we talk about the coordination of fiscal policies in the Eurozone, or when we talk about agreeing on a common policy for reducing gas emissions and fighting against climate change. Right? And these are problems that require governments to cooperate. And the book tells us how a cooperative response to a collective action problem emerged in a different historical and political context, and this, in my view, makes it highly relevant for today as well. So let me tell you how we will proceed. I think Oliver will start by presenting his book for about 60 minutes roughly, and then we will have a 15 minutes discussion. And here we are especially pleased to have Federica Carughetti as a discussant today. Federica is a senior lecturer in history and political economy at King's College. And as her title indicates, she is also an expert in political economy. She has published a book in 2019 on the evolutions of Athenian democratic institutions, and her most recent book, published in 2021, lays the foundations for a new political economy framework. So we're very grateful to have her as a discussant today. Right? So as I said, the discussion will last for about 15 minutes, and then we will have a few minutes to take questions from the floor as well to Oliver and to Federica. Right? And finally, after this event, there will be a reception just in the atrium in this building. So you just have to exit the room and you'll be there, and you're of course very welcome to stay. Right? So without further delay, I'll hand it over to Oliver for his presentation.
Olivier, thank you so much for the kind words. Yep, that was a wonderful introduction, and I'm flattered and of course delighted. Thank you so much. Audience, thank you for coming, and thanks for listening to me. My title is, of course, what was the Holy Roman Empire and what monetary policies tell us about pre-modern multilateralism. And if you read the question from which I'm starting out, what was the Holy Roman Empire? Well, at least some of you will probably think of Volckart, who at some point quipped that it was neither holy nor Roman nor an empire, and we could in principle leave it at that. I mean, that answers the question. But I would like to convince you that there was actually a bit more to the issue. And I would also like to convince you of the idea that this is an important question for a number of reasons to which I'm going to come in a minute. But here's first of all the outline of my talk today. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my approach to the issues about which we are going to talk. I tell you about earlier research on the issues in which I'm interested today, and of course I'm also going to briefly introduce my hypothesis in this context. And then we are going to go in medias res, the constitution of the empire at work, the failure of Charles V's attempt to introduce a common currency in the early 1550s. There was a successful common currency a few years later that was introduced by Charles V's successor, but in my talk I'm going to focus on this failure of Charles V's attempt. And we are going to look at why that didn't really work out, and there I'm going to focus on two important issues: attendance at the imperial diets. The imperial diet was the kind of parliament that the Holy Roman Empire had, and at the factors that determined the degree of attendance, and then at a phenomenon that we can observe when we look at the procedures of the diet, at the acts of the diet, a phenomenon that social scientists call the bandwagon, and I'm going to explain to you how that worked in more detail a little later. And then obviously there will be a conclusion. But let's first start about with my approach. And here I should tell you that I'm focusing normally on monetary policy making when I'm looking at pre-modern monetary history. I'm not so much interested in macroeconomic consequences of politics. I'm rather interested in policy making and how that came about. And if you're interested in that, then of course a basic insight is that you can't analyze monetary policies without paying attention to well, the institutions that shaped decision-making. You need to look at how decision-making was organized, how it took place, and that requires you, of course, to focus on constitutional issues, on the constitution of the polity which you are analyzing, and that is what I'm doing here in this context. Now, why is all this important? Well, it is important because it takes us into the middle of a debate that has shaped much of the research on the history of the Holy Roman Empire over at least the last 2 decades or so. And well, let's have a quick look at the traditional view of the empire. There, research used to stress the estates, the members of the empire. Here, the colorful blotches here on that map. And the empire was always represented as pretty chaotic and fundamentally dysfunctional, as a kind of patchwork that was then thankfully finally overcome by Prussia in the 19th century. And you can imagine much of this research began in the 19th century, originated in the 19th century, and many of the historians who were arguing in this vein were primarily interested in justifying not only the rise of Prussia, but more specifically also Prussia's role in the destruction of the empire in the 18th century. And if you want to draw parallels to the present, I mean, the European Union is not at that stage yet, but Prussia's attitude towards the Holy Roman Empire was roughly the same as that of Viktor Orban to the European Union. And so that gives you an idea of the role of Prussia. Now here, this illustration is from a historical atlas that was first printed in the 19th century in 1877. That was actually the first edition. And this has shaped our view of German history ever since. Fragmented, lots of small territories, lots of disunity, diversity and all that. So that has shaped our view of German history. And this is exactly the kind of map that I encountered when I was, went to school and when I was a student. That we had a more recent edition of the Putzka. Everyone had that kind of thing. Well, the map looked a bit modernized, but essentially exactly like that. Now, since the 1970s, there has been a kind of backlash. Revisionist views have gained ground. And here, well, historians like Georg Schmidt, Klaus Hartmann, Johannes Volckart, Joachim Whaley are particularly important, and they are interpreting the Holy Roman Empire in an entirely different way. Not as a dysfunctional, moribund kind of system that was close to disintegration and basically dying off, at least since the end of the Hohenstaufen dynasty in the 13th century, but they present the Holy Roman Empire essentially as a premodern state that was not fundamentally different from its Western neighbors, like, for example, France or England. The only difference basically was that the empire was more decentralized and that it operated at several levels. There's, of course, the empire-wide level where political decision-making was taking place at the imperial diet, at that kind of proto-parliament that I mentioned. There are the so-called imperial circles, that's an administrative subdivision, and finally the individual members of the empire, the estates. And this is reflected by more recent editions of the Putzka, like, for example, here in this year. Here you get the imperial circles, and it looks a lot less fragmented than it used to look in the 19th century. And at the time when I was going to school and when I was a student and was using a more recent edition of the Putzka Atlas. And strikingly, this is actually much closer to the way that the empire was seen in the pre-modern era itself. Here, if you compare this map from the early 18th century, it also shows the circles, and this is what apparently people back then found interesting and relevant. So, yeah, there is this recent tendency of research to consider the empire, to see the empire as a perfectly regular pre-modern state with all that involves. It's only that decision-making takes place at least 3 levels, and these levels complement each other in the sense that there's a relatively clear division of labor between them, and each plays a specific role in political decision-making, the empire itself, the circles, and then the individual estates itself. And the term that was well coined by Georg Schmidt at the end of the last century is the complementary imperial state, and that has really well found a lot of resonance in more recent research. So yeah, why is that problematic? Well, I'm of course not only a historian, I would say I'm also a social scientist. And as a social scientist, when I think about pre-modern states, I tend to think of Weber, Max Weber, the sociologist 100 years ago, more than 100 years ago, and of his definition of a state. And Max Weber defined a state as a human community that successfully claims the monopoly of the legitimate use of physical force within a given territory. That's basically Weber's definition. And if we look at the empire from this perspective, then there's obviously a problem. If several authorities share that monopoly, there must be really a clear division of labor between them. Or else they start to compete with each other. And they can start to compete with each other, of course, at a regional level. That is perfectly all right. I mean, Massachusetts is competing with California. Why not? At least to a certain extent. Maybe they are competing for university students or something like that. Or within Germany, Bavaria could compete with Brandenburg, maybe for other things. That's all right, but there must also be a clear division of labor between the several levels of authority that historians have found in the empire. And here things get much more complicated. Here the empire, the circles, and the estates. Did there really, was there a division of labor that was as clear as it is implied by this more modern research? Or were there problems? Did the levels of authority ignore each other? Were they at loggerheads with each other? That are the relevant questions here. Well, my hypothesis in this context is, and that is what I want to convince you of today, is that the division of labor between these levels of authority suffered from systematic instances of dysfunctionality. And I call these instances of dysfunctionality systematic because they are linked fundamentally to the structure not only of the polity but of society at large. And I'm going to show you how that worked. And it would not have been possible to solve these problems, to overcome this kind of dysfunctionality without fundamentally reforming the whole of society in a way that happened really only at the end of the early modern period, and then first of all in France, and in a very, very violent way that never happened in the empire. So systematic instances of dysfunctionality which really affected especially political decision-making, and these instances of dysfunctionality rule out, in my view, interpreting the empire as a modern state, in the sense of Weber, but they also rule out interpreting the empire as a pre-modern state that's comparable to England or France. England or France in the early modern period may have had their own instances of dysfunctionality in other areas, but certainly not in the where decision-making was concerned, and not to the same extent as the Holy Roman Empire. So in my view, interpreting the empire as a pre-modern, specifically pre-modern, multilateral system works better. It allows us better to explain what was going on than seeing the empire as a state. Yeah, so much for this, so much for earlier research and my hypothesis in this context. Let me now come to the constitution at work, so how the constitution of the empire actually worked. And here we need to start out from one really fundamental issue, and that is that the status of the members of the empire differed. And I'm showing this here in this map because, well, these differences are really, really important for how decision-making worked. So we have got a number of outlying members of the empire here in the border regions, also in northern Italy. These were fiefs of the emperor, part of the empire, but they were outlying, and that they were not involved in centralized decision-making, and they were not expected to contribute, for example, to defense or into the financing of the law courts and things like that. So that leaves us with a kind of inner empire here, roughly the area that's modern Germany and Austria, a bit more maybe, but that's roughly the area. Outlying members not involved in legislation, not expected to contribute to defense and jurisdiction. But the inner empire is subdivided into, well, territories and members of very, very different status too. So there are the so-called electors here in violet, who have the right to elect the emperor, normally for life. So Charles V retired before he died, but normally the emperors are elected for life. Then there are other princes here in green, and their status in itself is uneven. Some of them have a viral vote in the imperial diet, which means they can vote individually. Others, the lighter green, the estates in lighter green, vote jointly, and they have got collegiate votes. And finally, there are also imperial cities. And these three groups, the electors, the princes, and the cities, form three houses of parliament. If you want, three colleges is the normal term in this period. Now, how does this work in detail? Let's have a look, and this is normally how I visualize the constitution of the empire. Now, that looks pretty confusing, I think, at first, but it's relatively straightforward, and the only part of this graph on which we need to focus is this here. So we can forget all about that. So that's not really important for the moment. So here we have the three colleges or houses of parliament: the electors, the princes, and the cities. The electors and the princes are really required to agree on a law if the emperor is supposed to pass the law. The cities are not required to agree. They don't have a decisive vote. They have a votum consultativum, much less important. And the electors and princes occasionally, quite often actually, also discuss issues together, imperial diet and joint sessions. Then the imperial diet, if these two groups have agreed on a bill, and the emperor has signed off the bill, the imperial diet passes this kind of framework legislation, and that legislation is then taken up by the imperial circles and then defined a bit more in a bit more detail as framework legislation that then passes on to territorial diets and urban magistrates and so on. That's basically how it works, and that is the important thing. Now, I'm going to focus on the imperial diet and on the behavior of princes and electors on that imperial diet. That is really important here in our context. Now, let's have a look at one instance where we can observe a really important coordination failure, and this concerns monetary policies, and that is why this is really important in the context of my book. So, at the end of the 1540s, most members of the empire, except electoral Saxony, one of the electors that were allowed to elect the emperor, agreed on a standard for a common coinage of the empire. What they didn't agree on was whether this common coinage should be bimetallic or duometallic. I'm going to explain the difference in a second, but let's first see why did electoral Saxony not agree on that. Well, basically because of this. That's a Saxon thaler. That is basically the most prestigious product of the Saxon mints. It's a relatively large and heavy silver coin that was extremely popular. So this was issued as a 21 groschens piece, and it was supposed to circulate by the government, by the Saxon government, at the value of 21 groschens, but it was traded at 24 to 26 groschens. It was highly overvalued. And evidently, if a government issues a currency that's overvalued to that extent, that of course makes it very easy to import, for example, food, which was important in particular in Saxony, that had a relatively large share of the population working in industry and living in cities and so on. So the Saxon government didn't want to give this up, and they didn't agree on the standard of the silver coinage that had been agreed by basically all other members of the empire. Now, what was the problem, or the issue here, the disagreement about bimetallic and dual metallic? Well, that's essentially relatively simple. A bimetallic currency is a currency that consists both of silver coins and gold coins that circulate not only at the same time and in parallel, but at fixed legal rates. So, for example, 10 silver pieces always equal 1 gold piece, and that is determined by law. A dual metallic currency also consists of gold and silver that circulate in parallel, but they don't circulate at fixed rates, they circulate at floating rates. And that was normally what happened in the Middle Ages. Now, many of the estates of the empire wanted to introduce a bimetallic currency, but actually not all of them, and there were 3 parties. So there were indebted princes who needed gold to service their obligations. Many of the debts that these princes had incurred were denominated in gold, and they had to be serviced in gold. That is a result of late medieval philosophy, basically. Thomas Aquinas was particularly important in this context, and Aquinas argued that if you had borrowed something, you had to repay your loan in essentially the same kind of goods. So if you borrowed wheat, say 100 liters of wheat, you had to repay 100 liters of wheat and not rye. And if you borrowed gold, you had to repay gold and not silver. And that was widely accepted. And in the early 16th century, if you had debts in gold, you were expected to repay them in gold. Now, why was that a problem? Simple. The empire had a number of really, really important and very productive districts where silver was being mined. The so-called mining boom of the late 15th and early 16th century. So the output of silver grew by leaps and bounds. The output of gold was pretty stable. In other words, the consequence was that gold was constantly appreciating in terms of silver, or silver, conversely, was losing value in terms of gold. Obviously, if your debts were denominated in gold and you wanted to service them, and gold was appreciating all the time, that was a problem. And here, a bimetallic currency where the gold-silver ratio, the legal gold-silver ratio, was fixed once and for all by law, would have solved the issue for the indebted princes. However, not everyone, of course, was of this opinion. There were some, in particular the electors on the Rhine, the electors of Mainz and Trier, Cologne, and of the Palatinate. Their revenues consisted mostly of the tolls collected in gold, the tolls on the Rhine. And the Rhine was the most important trade route that was connecting the economic poles of Europe at that time, northern Italy and the Netherlands are the most prosperous areas of Europe. And the trade between Italy and the Netherlands went along the Rhine. And sitting on the Rhine and being able to tax that trade was really a gold mine, literally. So they collected gold in heaps, and obviously they were not interested in fixing the value of that gold once and for all. They were interested in a dual metallic system where the relative value of gold and silver could continue to float. So if gold became more valuable and a merchant traveling along the Rhine was unable to pay the dues in gold, then they could extort more silver from him. And that is something in which they were interested. Third party here in this context were, of course, this is Rhenish Gulden, I should say. That was one of these pieces minted from the gold collected at the Rhine tolls. And just to show you this, the third party, of course, was Saxony, that wanted everybody else to adopt the thaler. So that's basically the setup that led to this coordination failure in the subsequent years. Now, where exactly did coordination fail? Well, in 1551, July 1550 to early 1551, the Imperial Diet met. And they discussed this issue, and the Imperial Diet drafted a bill for a common currency that left the bimetallism question open. So they didn't agree on that. But still, the Diet asked the Emperor to publish that bill. Now, what was the Emperor Charles V supposed to do? Well, he decided to unilaterally opt for bimetallism. Obviously, he was heavily indebted himself, and signed and published the bill. And Why could he do that? Why did he do that unilaterally? Well, his counselors argued that in cases of discord in the common affairs of the Holy Empire, when the estates fail to agree despite all their diligence, it is held that His Majesty, as the head of the empire, is necessarily burdened with resolving the issue, because otherwise it could not be known how or by whom those affairs and tasks of the Holy Empire that cannot bear a delay or deferral should be finally decided. That is what Charles V's counselors claimed. And Charles V followed that advice, unilaterally opted for bimetallism and signed the bill. And obviously, most imperial circles publicized the bill, most imperial estates published it too and began to put in praxis, but not the Upper Saxon circle that was dominated by electoral Saxony, and not the electoral Rhenish circle. They simply refused and they ignored imperial legislation. Eclatant failure of coordination. Now the question, of course, is why did some of the members of the Diet who asked the emperor to publish this bill refuse to implement it? Why was that the case? Or conversely, why did these members of the empire agree to asking the emperor to publicize the bill even though they rejected it in principle? That is really the question that we need to answer. And they knew that Charles V would opt for bimetallism, and that was not in their interest. And they still asked him to publish the bill. Why did they do so? And here I've got an explanation or hypothesis to which we are going to come now. But let's first look at how we can approach these issues in a bit more, systematic way. There are actually two problems, and I briefly mentioned that at the beginning of my talk: Diet attendance and legitimacy, and the second problem is the bandwagon effect, which I mentioned, to which I'm going to come in a minute. Now, why is Diet attendance and legitimacy important? Basically, it's important because the empire didn't have any resources that would have allowed it to enforce its decisions. The emperor could occasionally enforce his own decisions in Austria or maybe in the Netherlands, but certainly not in other parts of the empire. So he was really dependent on voluntary cooperation. That is how the empire worked. If there was no voluntary cooperation, it didn't work at all. Now, decisions made by the imperial diet were more likely to be implemented if they were regarded as legitimate by the members of the empire. And here, one phenomenon that has been analyzed by the sociologist Niklas Luhmann in the 1960s is particularly important, so-called procedural legitimacy. What is this? It's really quite simple. The core idea is perfectly straightforward. The core idea is that decision-making is structured by rules. For example, at the imperial diet. The imperial diet follows certain rules. It's structured in these three colleges and so on, and the colleges vote and discuss things according to rules. And because attendance at the diets was voluntary, attendance at the diets demonstrates, first of all, that the members of the empire who were at the diet accepted the procedures as legitimate, and then if they did that, it, by implication, also demonstrated that they accepted the decisions themselves as legitimate. And the idea of Luhmann and historians who follow him is that the likelihood of a decision to be enforced or implemented is larger if it is widely regarded as legitimate. Now, diet attendance is really important in this context, and I looked at that, and that's the data I found. So here we have roughly 300 members of the empire. That's the total number, a bit more than 300, maybe 305 or so. And you see many more than 200 were never there. So 2/3 roughly was the maximum that attended. There were always members of the empire who didn't turn up to the imperial diets, which took place every few years. Here, Worms 1521, Nuremberg 22, and so on. That went on almost every year, not quite every year. Many of these diets were also attended by princes and rulers themselves. Not every ruler came. Many rulers only sent delegations. we know about the size of the delegations, we know how many delegates were attended the ruler if he came himself or were sent by rulers who didn't come themselves. We also know the profession of the delegates and whether they had a university degree and all that kind of thing. So we are really quite well informed about these things. Now, what did I find? I looked at that in much more detail, of course. I found that the important thing, the most important factor that determines attendance is really distance. And I found that with every additional 10 miles, the likelihood that one of the members of the empire would attend the imperial diet dropped by roughly almost 1%. And the likelihood of a ruler attending dropped by 0.6%. I found that in the course of a panel logic regression, and which showed this. What the regressions also showed was that with increasing distance, the size of the delegation shrank. And that is, of course, exactly what you would expect. Sending a delegation to the imperial diet is costly, and the more distant the diet is, the more costly it is, so you don't send such a large delegation. There's one countervailing effect here, time, which I also considered. Both the number of estates present, the number of rulers attending, and the number of university trained counselors increased over time. And that is really significant. So over time, things became better. What all this shows us is that outlying regions of the empire, in particular the north and the northeast, that were very, very far, very distant from the places where diets were taking place, were much less likely to implement decisions of the diet. However, conditions did improve over time. That is something that needs to be noted in this context. Now, what about the second problem at which I was looking, the so-called bandwagon effect? The bandwagon effect is a relatively common phenomenon. Basically, it says that the likelihood of behaving in a certain way, whether you buy commodities in a market or vote for politicians or whatever you do, is the higher, the larger, the more people have already behaved in that way. So if you observe other people buying certain commodities, there's a certain likelihood that you also buy these commodities. If you observe other people behave in a certain way, it is quite likely that you will begin to behave in that way as well. Now, what is really important here is the unequal status of the members of the diet. The ranking between the colleges, with the college of the electors at the top, and then the princes, and finally the towns or cities, but also within the colleges. There are literally no peers in the Holy Roman Empire. Peers are people who are equal. Here, the members of the diet are highly unequal, and there's a clear ranking in each of these colleges. So, for example, in the Prince's College, Austria is always on top. Salzburg comes second. Bavaria third, and so on. Occasionally there are squabbles about these things, but there's a clear ranking, there are no peers. And the interesting thing is that voting in the colleges is not simultaneous, but sequential and open. So if you rank high, you vote earlier. If your rank is low, then you vote much later. That is the interesting thing here, and that is why the imperial diet is really the ideal environment for a bandwagon effect to play out. Lower ranking voters can observe in which way higher ranking earlier voters have cast their votes. Voting is open, they can observe that, and then they can take these earlier decisions into account and see whether they vote in the same way or not. Now, how did that play out in detail? Let's have a look at an example. And the example is taken from the imperial diet of 1550 and 1551, a diet that took about 7 months. And here, shortly before that began, in June 1550, the elector of Saxony instructed his delegation. He didn't come himself, he sent a delegation, and he instructed his delegation to reject the common currency bill that was drafted by that diet. And that's of course exactly what his delegation did at the start of the diet. August 7, the first time that monetary issues were debated, they rejected the draft, exactly as in the way they were supposed to do. But well, discussions continued, and the Prince's College was meeting jointly with the Electors' College, and there were really intensive talks. And well, by the 17th of August, only 10 days later, the Saxon delegates had come around so far that they said that if others think it necessary, they will willingly promote what is pleasing to the emperor. And it is perfectly obvious what in this context was pleasing to the emperor. That's not quite the end of the story. It went on. By November, they declared that they do not want to distance themselves from the majority, again, within the context of monetary policy debates, where the common currency was the issue. And when the Diet finished in February of 1551, they were basically ready. They had come round. They signed on the dotted line, and that was it. And that is the bandwagon effect. At least in my interpretation, it is. That is how this played out. Now, we can look at this in more detail, and I did that too, and I analyzed on which factors the likelihood of voting like a preceding voter depended, and I found that social status is really decisive. So if your social status is low, the likelihood that you will be voting like an earlier voter is much, much higher than if your social status is high. And this is particularly important in the context of the ecclesiastical princes represented at the imperial diet, because they were mostly bishops, and bishops could come from all kinds of social backgrounds. There were bishops who, well, were members of important princely dynasties. There were also bishops, well, who were members of the minor nobility. Some bishops were also, their background was in the bourgeoisie of the imperial towns. And the larger the gap between the social status of a preceding voter and your own social status, the higher was the likelihood that you would vote like the preceding voter. So if, for example, a bishop had a bourgeois background, if his family came from one of the imperial cities, and the preceding voter had a high status, was a member of one of the big princely dynasties, it was really, really likely that the bishop would vote exactly in the way that the earlier voter had cast his vote, regardless of what he had thought before the debate had been his best interest. So people neglected their own best interest in favor of voting like someone earlier. Another important thing is wealth. Now, wealth is, of course, difficult to approximate. Here I used the contributions to the finances of the empire as a proxy for wealth. So I looked at how much were these imperial estates, the members of the empire, expected to contribute for defense, for example, or how much were they expected to contribute to the upkeep of the common court of the high courts of the empire. And I constructed a common factor and used that in this analysis. And I found that poor estates, who apparently were economically relatively weak, tended to vote like earlier wealthier estates. And again, that is something that is not terribly surprising. Distance, is slightly different. What I found and what surprised me is that the larger the distance between the residences of the members of the empire was, their home residences, the more likely were they to vote in the same way. And well, I was really puzzled by this. So neighbors don't vote in the same way. You would observe how your neighbor is voting, and then you would do the opposite. So what does this show? I think it probably shows a lot of distrust between the members of the empire, in particular here in the period of religious tension of the Reformation and in the period before the religious peace of Augsburg that largely settled these issues for at least a number of decades. So I also looked at a number of further factors, like, for example, dynastic allegiance. I tried to approximate dynastic allegiance by counting the number of common ancestors 4 generations back. And I found that this didn't have any effect at all. So squabbles within families were just as important as familial unity. So that's not really important. What is important is that given these factors, what we can really see is that voting is systematically influenced by factors unrelated to the issue at hand. So the voters in the imperial diet do not just consider monetary issues when they cast their vote on the common currency. They also consider how wealthy an earlier voter is, how high the status of the earlier voter is, whether the earlier voter is a neighbor or is living far away. Things like that play a large role, and not so much monetary issues that really matter, and that you would expect voters to take into account. That is really the bandwagon effect. That is why this is important. So, estates jumping on the bandwagon realize that they vote against their own best interest. As soon as the diet disperses, as soon as the pressure and example of higher ranking or more wealthy voters is gone, they remember what they have done, and get second thoughts. And then they refuse to implement what the diet has decided. And that is the origin of all this dysfunctionality that we observe. Now, why is this really systematically important? It is important because the ranking of the members of the diet is only one part of a social system that is fundamentally unequal, and that's characterized by fundamental inequality. And when I'm talking of inequality here, I don't mean income inequality or the inequality of wealth. That existed too, and that's also important. What's important here is primarily institutional inequality. The ranking of the estates among themselves, the fact that higher ranking estates enjoyed privileges that lower ranking members of the empire did not enjoy. And this ranking began really with the emperor at the top, went over the electors, over the other princes, over the counts and barons that were represented at the imperial diet, over the burgomasters who occasionally came, and so on, down to craftsmen, and finally to peasants, to what was called the common man. So the whole society is clearly ranked in this way. It's unequal, fundamentally unequal, much more unequal than other European societies in this period. This kind of inequality did not exist to the same extent, for example, in England, which is why when English visitors traveled through Germany, they found the Germans always extremely tedious with their styles and titles, because they always put a lot of placed a lot of importance on addressing people in the correct way and so on. So the important thing is that once the diet has dispersed, the voters, many of the voters realize that they have voted against their own best interests under the influence of the bandwagon phenomenon, and then they go back on their promises, refuse to implement what they had agreed, and that explains this dysfunctionality that we have been observing. And that already takes me to the conclusion. And well, I'd say multilateralism is not an exclusively modern phenomenon. If we think about multilateral systems, we normally think about systems that came about from the end of the Second World War on, or that emerged in the course of the Second World War, the United Nations, other organizations like NATO or the European Union, of course. That is something that is modern, that may be under threat in recent years, but we do observe multilateral systems in other historical contexts too, and the Holy Roman Empire certainly is such a system. At least that is how I read that system. Pre-modern multilateralism is, though, essentially different from modern multilateralism. In the European Union, for example, the typical multilateral system with which we are all familiar to a certain extent, well, the members may be unequal in an informal sense, and that's of course obvious. Some members have more influence than others, but formally at least they are equal, regardless of their size. Formally, Luxembourg is just as much a sovereign state as France or Poland or any other member of the European Union. Here, in the Holy Roman Empire, in a pre-modern multilateral system, that's not the case. The members are unequal, not only informally but also formally. Some enjoy privileges that others don't enjoy. Important in this context, the high costs of attending decision-making assemblies, lack of attendance of the outlying members, and then lack of legitimacy and a lower likelihood that decisions made by the center would be implemented, and most importantly, inequality among the members voting system that tends to generate agreement, but the agreement is superficial. It tends to fall apart once the imperial diet has dispersed. And so on the whole, I think analyzing the empire as a state on par with France or England really doesn't work particularly well. It doesn't take us very far. Analyzing it as a specifically pre-modern multilateral system allows us to explain what was going on in far more detail. And that is why I'm really in favor of this interpretation, rather than of the current orthodoxy that says that the empire was a state. And that's basically what I wanted to tell you today.
Good, thank you. I don't think that's working. Well, thanks so much. It's actually the second time that I see you present this book, and you managed to present it in two completely different ways, which is interesting and intriguing. But yeah, thanks, that was very clear. So now I suggest we move on to the discussion. So,
yeah.
Federico.
Absolutely. So I just wanted to say thank you to Oliver for the opportunity to be here tonight and comment on this book, but also for the opportunity to read the book, which, as Olivier mentioned earlier, is actually comes to life in the writing, in the anecdotes that really reveal this extraordinary work on the primary sources that we could only just glimpse in the presentation tonight. And incidentally, I should say that reading this book finally gave meaning to the traumatic experience of having taken a class in numismatics in my PhD. So sort of finally that makes sense. So I appreciate that. But I sort of in this presentation you have focused on the priors and the dysfunction. But then the common currency happens, right?
Yes.
And so maybe you can say a little bit more about how we get from the dysfunctionalities sort of driven by distance and bandwagon effects to the moment in which this currency is actually becomes reality.
Yep. I think that's of course one really interesting issue, and I admit in my presentation I was focusing on institutional issues, on systematic issues, but that's of course not the whole story. There's more to the thing, and for example, there is power politics involved in all this. There is the Emperor, Charles V, who tries to utilize his relatively strong military position in the late 1540s in order to improve his own constitutional position, to reform the constitution of the empire in his interest, and to push through the common currency in this context. So Charles V is he was born in Flanders, of course. He became king of Spain at a relatively early age, Holy Roman Empire shortly thereafter, and he was always extremely convinced of his vocation, and as the head of Christendom, the secular head of Christendom, the essential counterpart of the Pope, and if push came to shove, he always favored strong-arm policies and authoritarian approaches. This is also reflected in his decision to simply override the opposition of important members of the empire, like, for example, the electors on the Rhine, who he knew didn't want a bimetallic currency and who were really powerful and whose cooperation he needed. But he thought if he decided that unilaterally and made the decision known with the help of one of his supreme military commanders who had just defeated a few Protestant princes, then he would have a good chance of getting of enforcing the whole thing. It didn't work. The empire didn't work in that way. Now there was a second brief rebellion against Charles V a few years later, 1552, and that really caught him on the hop, and he was forced to flee across the Alps, humiliated by that experience, and of course also humiliated by his failure reform the constitution of the empire and to introduce the common currency. And then he had a younger brother who evidently was willing to compromise it. He found that just disgusting, so he resigned and retired to this monastery in Spain, and that was it. And his younger brother was really an entirely different character, Ferdinand I, much more sociable and willing to compromise. He had signaled his willingness to compromise not only in religious issues. He negotiated this religious Peace of Augsburg, which was really brilliant, a masterstroke of diplomacy, and kept the empire afloat for another 250 years. But he also negotiated a compromise where monetary policies were concerned, and that was a real compromise, not just the imposition of, the emperor's own ideas. The compromise worked in the way that he went some way to accommodate the ideas of the electors on the Rhine. He abolished this idea of bimetallism. He opted for duometallism. But on the other hand, the structure of the currency that he suggested was basically the currency that was traditionally used in Austria. And that was something on which everyone could agree. That is how this currency was then finally adopted by basically the whole empire, including, interestingly, Saxony in the 1560s. So I think power politics does play a role. Characters also play a role. There are idiosyncrasies like that in politics, and neglecting them takes us only so far.
I mean, this is somewhat like a scary story. If one thinks that we can rely on institutions to preserve ourselves from powerful individuals, your story is actually telling us that in this case the institutions are quite dysfunctional themselves. But there's clearly a sense, and particularly as it came out of these comments and these reflections now, there is a sense that sort of like a power politics will trump whatever institutions or whatever institutional dysfunctions there might be. And what are we left with?
I don't think it's, we can't really say that, I think. Power politics won't trump that. The institutions may be dysfunctional, but they are relatively strong and firmly entrenched. And we see that, we can observe it, how Charles V's attempt to introduce a common currency against the wishes of really important players in the empire, whose political role was institutionally defined. They made up the members of the electors' college. How that attempt could come to grief. So institutions are still important, and I think one reason why Ferdinand I was so successful, Charles V's younger brother and successor, why he was really successful with the introduction of his common currency was that he played the system. He was unable to really solve the problems and to overcome these dysfunctionalities. That would have required reforming the complete society, abolishing institutional differences, legal differences, establishing legal equality, all that stuff that only came with the French Revolution. Of course he didn't consider that. But if you were willing to compromise, if you were willing to, engage in a kind of give and take, you could go quite a long way, and that is what he did. So the currency he adopted or he introduced really worked reasonably well for 4 or 5 decades at least. And I mean, compared to the euro, which has been around 2.5 decades now, 4 or 5 decades, it looks quite good. I mean, let's see how long the euro is going to survive.
Another terrifying thought from spoken from here. I guess that, do I have time for another question?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I guess that to sort of like test the thesis, and perhaps to even sort of like push you a little further on the question of is this like a game of power politics? Is it a game of institutional mechanisms? I wonder if you can speak about like other instantiations of cooperation success. You're talking about sort of like a dysfunctional empire marred by power politics, marred by potential sort of like dysfunctions at the level of mechanisms. But then in some respects, like the thesis is weak or less robust if it can only be proven in the context of this particularly sort of like a peculiarly needed, perhaps. And maybe you've also spoken a little bit less about the reason why the story of the the conversation about the common currency came about tonight. So maybe you can address a little bit of the sort of like the reasons why the common currency comes about as a conversation, but also why, like what are the instances of successful collective action can we detect in the story of this period?
Well, so why were the majority of the members of the empire interested in overcoming monetary diversity in the empire? Well, I think traditionally historians who have looked at that have always stressed basically modern points of view, like helping trade, helping economic integration. In the sources at which I looked, I found nothing of that kind. Apparently, none of the members of the imperial diet, not even the free imperial cities represented at the diet, argued ever that a common currency would help trade or economic integration, or that more trade and economic integration would be a good thing. So that was never considered. And at least the members of the two higher colleges really despised and, despised merchants and representatives of towns that were dominated by merchants. They distrusted them and despised them. That is very, very evident. Now, why did they still want a common currency? Well, in the second decade of the 16th century, there were roughly 120 to 140 political authorities in the empire that issued their own coins. And some of them had access to their own silver mines or gold mines. And if they had that, if they controlled their own gold mines or silver mines, mostly silver mines, like for example in the Tyrol, the Habsburgs, or in Saxony, then producing their own currencies, their own coinage was not a big problem. But the majority of the members of the empire didn't have any easy access to gold or silver. They had to buy that material on the market if they wanted to issue their own currencies. Now, how could they get that material? How could they get bullion, gold and silver? Silver primarily. Well, the most popular way was using money minted by their neighbors as raw material, collecting that, melting it down, mixing it with a bit of copper, and producing coins that looked almost, if not quite, like the originals. And that worked reasonably well, because we're here dealing with a society where we need to be aware of the fact that the vast majority of the population is simply illiterate for practical purposes. So maybe roughly 20% of the population are able to sign their names. But what does that tell us? That does certainly not tell us that they would have been able to read reasonably complex text and understand them. Most of the population is unable to distinguish good coins and bad imitations. And they, at least initially, accept the bad imitations exactly the same way they accepted the good originals. And obviously there are some actors, some economic actors who do realize that there's a difference. For example, experienced merchants or professional goldsmiths, professional money changers, they realize that there are good and bad coins about, and they collect the better coins and keep them back. Some of them sell them to neighboring mints as raw material, as usual. But the effect of all this is that the good money disappears from circulation and the bad imitations begin to dominate in the market. And this, well, what is the government supposed to do that is affected by that kind of neighborly policies? So if your neighbors all imitate your money, and the imitations are really poor quality, and this poor quality money begins to dominate your own market, what can you do? Well, the first solution on which most polities found was that they reduced the bullion content of their own money too. Now that, of course, set off a chain reaction. There were worse and worse imitations, and we get that race to the bottom. Continual debasement, money gets worse and worse. Eventually, bad imitations turn up in tax payments, and then, of course, all these authorities begin to have second thoughts about that kind of issue. And that is why they realized after several decades of this that a common currency would be the only sustainable solution to that problem, at least as far as Germany was concerned.
one final one?
Sure.
Because this, I think, takes us back to my earlier question about the sort of like what works in after 1559 when the full common currency bill actually passes. And you did give me the story of, as a political scientist, I want to know about power, so I want to know about, the intricacies of the succession between Charles I and Ferdinand I, Charles V and Ferdinand I. But you have a whole story about incentives and about actually institutional mechanisms that enable this sort of like a decentralized, multilateral structure to successfully continue to monitor the sort of like the fortunes of the bill. So maybe you can speak a little bit about that before.
And that reminds me, I didn't answer part of your last question. I didn't answer the part that concerned an instance of successful cooperation.
You can choose whichever you want to answer.
No, both are linked now.
Right.
So how did they successfully cooperate after the end of the 1550s, and how did they manage to implement that currency despite so many different authorities issuing money basically autonomously? Why didn't they undercut each other, and why didn't this race to the bottom start again? How did they make sure of that? Well, they created incentives that made it worthwhile to observe imperial law in this context and not to violate the common currency bill. Of course, there were, on the face of it, relatively strong incentives for each member of the empire to produce money that looked exactly like the money that the common currency bill was supposed to introduce, but contained less silver or gold. If one had done that, obviously we would have got the whole story again, raised to the bottom and all that, and the common currency would have fallen apart. How did they prevent that? Incentives were crucial. What the bill that introduced the common currency was supplemented by a second bill that created biannual meetings at the level of the imperial circles, the subdivisions of the empire that you could see on the map that I had showed to you at the beginning of my talk. The members of these circles were supposed to meet twice yearly to test and analyze coins that had been issued in the meantime. The important thing is, there were always members of the empire who didn't issue their own money, but they were required to attend these meetings too, and they had a strong interest in attending these meetings because obviously they depended on money that was produced by their neighbors. And they had a strong interest in making sure that the neighbors were producing money that conformed to imperial law. So they had really strong interest in bringing poorly produced money, bad imitations, to the attentions of these assemblies, and then the assemblies would go and basically penalize the producer of these poor imitations. That happened relatively consistently in the second half of the 16th century. Also, the number of mints was reduced to 4 per circle, and so that helped keeping track of what was being produced too. And so in that respect, the system worked relatively well. But I think requiring members of the empire that didn't issue their own coins to attend these meetings was really kind of masterstroke politically, because they were really the people who had a strong interest in making sure that money was produced according to the legal standard.
Well, thank you for the discussion. We're a bit ahead of schedule, which is good, so I'm going to use my privilege here and ask you a couple of questions as well before we open the questions to the floor. So first of all, I mean, there's something you didn't mention here, but which is in the book, which is a discussion of changing conceptions of money and monetary policy. And you know, when we try to explain economic policies, there's always a debate between the role of ideology, intellectual conceptions, theories, versus the role of structural forces, social forces, political economy forces like vested interests. So what is your take on which of the two eventually drove the decision to create this common currency?
Well, as a proper historian, I'm of course always in favor of multifaceted explanations and not monocausality. So no, I think there is one important instance that really shows us that that mental models, if we want to use that term that was used by Denso and North in this in a different context, that mental models may also shape policies. So, well, you know, up to the middle of the 1540s, the factor that prevented an agreement on a common monetary standard was the idea that before you could agree on such a standard, you would need to agree on an empire-wide uniform silver price. Because obviously there were some members of the empire who had access to their own silver mines. Others had to buy the stuff. If you had access to your own silver mines, you could get the raw material cheaply. Producing the money would be cheap. Whereas if you had to buy silver in the open market, that would be much more expensive, and you wouldn't make any profit producing the common coinage. And that was, well, basically it was resentment and envy that prevented the agreement on a common standard. What happened in the 1540s was that the imperial estates realized, or that a coinage committee at the imperial diet realized, that this was actually not the case, that this was, the argument was faulty. And what the committee realized was that most mints bought raw silver or raw materials needed for producing coins in exchange for minted silver. And obviously you would never be able to pay more silver in the form of coins in order to buy raw silver than the amount of raw silver that you were buying with the coins. So the upshot of all this is that what the imperial diet realized was that under a commodity money system, money is always entering circulation at a value that's slightly higher than its intrinsic value. And the difference between the intrinsic value and the value at which money is entering circulation is used to cover the rest of the production costs, like, for example, labor costs or costs for other raw materials except precious metals and so on. And if that's the case, the upshot is that you don't need first to agree on a common silver price across the whole empire. The common silver price will come about on its own once you have created common currency. No one is going to pay more for the raw silver than, well, what the silver that the money contains. And that is something that people realized in the course of the 1540s, and that made the agreement on a common monetary standard possible. And I think this is really, that's an instance where people changed their mental models in reaction to evidence that they were confronted with. And so this is certainly important as well.
Okay. Yeah, and then, maybe quickly, I was interested and fascinated by your evidence on the bandwagon effect. I'm just wondering, was it out of fear or respect that the lower ranked voters would vote and follow the highest ranked ones, even though that contradicted their own best interest, or was it a pure psychological behavioral effect?
Yeah.
What do you think here?
Yeah, I mean, you're addressing a really, really very common problem, isn't it? The same kind of behavior can be motivated by all kinds of different psychic conditions or considerations. And the sources, of course, don't tell us what these people were really thinking. I mean, we can just observe how they voted. And if they voted like a preceding voter whose rank was higher, they may have voted like that preceding voter because that had been their intention all along, and because they generally thought that this was in their own best interest, or because they didn't want to antagonize that higher-ranking voter, or because they wanted to marry their daughter to the son of that higher-ranking voter. all kinds of things can have been important in this context. What we can observe is that higher rank really played an important role. The motive behind it, I don't know.
Yeah, difficult to know. Very good. So yeah, I think it's time now to open the discussion to the floor. So I already see a question here, please.
Thank you for the presentation. My name is Ignacio Uca. I'm an undergrad student here at LSE. And I wanted to ask a really basic high-level question on, if I remember correctly from my high school history lessons, France, just a couple of centuries earlier, was also experiencing really big fragmentation, decentralization. So my question is, what was the reason for France becoming a more centralized state, even in the premodern era, versus while the Germany, the Holy Roman Empire, remained more decentralized?
Yeah, decentralized. Yeah, good question, and I should of course stress that I'm not an expert on French medieval history. However, the unification of the French currency came about in roughly the same way. It was also a reaction to the so-called guerre monétaire that was going on in France at the time when there were still baronial currencies and feudal currencies that competed with the currency issued by the king in Paris. The political unification of France, or the centralization of France, seems to have come about in reaction to the widespread uncertainty, insecurity in the course of the 100 Years' War. You know about the 100 Years' War. That was a war that the King of England began to wage against France in the 1330s, and that dragged on until the middle of the 15th century. And that was mainly fought on French soil, and France was devastated to a shocking degree. Now, why did that help political centralization? Apparently, the French towns were, and the merchants in French towns, were strongly interested in security, evidently because that helped trade. The French towns were wealthy enough in order to promise the kings to pay regular taxes in exchange for safety, basically. And the kings collected these taxes and used them basically to buy out the big French nobles from the political market. So the members of the rival dynasties or the cadet branches of the Carpathian dynasty got appanages, got nice castles and so on, but only in exchange for giving up their political autonomy. And I think that was probably how France became far more centralized. Now, why didn't that work in the empire? My guess is it didn't work because urbanization had begun so much later, east of the Rhine and north of the Danube, than in France. France had been urbanized to a certain degree, at least since antiquity, since the Roman Empire, if not earlier than that. French cities were well established, relatively well established in trade at an early date, at a time when cities east of the Rhine were still fairly small, far apart. So when the emperors of the Holy Roman Empire still had a chance to create a more unified or more centralized political structure, they could never rely on cities being able to provide them with tax payments. The cities were too poor, too weakly developed at that time. And once the cities had become more developed and wealthy, the structure had already fallen apart. Does that answer your question? Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. My name's Kyle. I'm a research assistant at Oxford. I was wondering about, you mentioned one particular currency that was highly overvalued pre kind of centralization. In an environment where there was a great deal of currency forgery and a great deal of currency merchants, how were they able to kind of establish this and maintain this overvaluation?
Yeah. I think the crucial factor is that most of the the consumers who used high-value coins like the thaler, which was overvalued to this degree, were really, really well informed. The thaler was not the type of money that you could use in everyday transactions. The purchasing power was far too high. So it was a type of money that was used in political transactions, in wholesale trade, in long-distance trade, in things like that. However, people involved in that kind of transactions were well informed and had the chance to check whether the bullion content of the money that we're using was actually what it was supposed to be. So it was always far easier to debase and fake small change that was used by the common man who was poorly informed and had no chance to check whether the money was as valuable as it's supposed to be, than to debase high-value money like the thaler. And the thaler was still relatively new at that time, so there hadn't been much of a chance to debase it so far and to imitate it.
Thanks, Oliver. That was really interesting. I kind of wondered about the excuse me, about the bandwagon effect. Do you think that the bandwagon effect was stronger for, say, currency votes than in other types of votes?
Oh.
Like, do you think, like, you know, or is this just a feature of the institution that is kind of constant? You know.
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I must say I don't know the answer. I have not looked at that from this perspective. So I've looked just at one diet, at roughly 1,000 votes that were cast, and yeah, but no, I didn't really consider the topics about which voting was going on. It was about all kinds of things. The 1,000 votes at which I was looking concerned security, the defense against the Ottomans, contributions to the imperial high courts, religious issues, monetary issues, all that kind of thing. Yeah, I should have considered that probably, but yeah,
Now you
I
know what
will
to
do
do in
it.
your sabbatical.
Yeah, yeah, it's a good topic for that. Thank you, Eric. I will remember that.
Hi, so I have just a question about the epilogue of the story. So how did the meltdown of the empire impacted the currency?
Well, in fact, the meltdown of the empire didn't really impact the currency at all. The currency melted down before the empire. So yeah, yeah, things went reasonably well for roughly 4 or 5 decades after the common currency had been introduced. However, there was one problem that really destabilized the system in the long run. And well, that was the Netherlands, basically. So why were the Netherlands a problem? Basically because they were so highly developed and highly urbanized, and they were increasingly dependent on imported food. And where did they buy that food? Mostly in countries adjacent to the Netherlands, in particular to the east. So North Germany and further east along the coast of the Baltics, that's particularly the import of grain, Polish grain, but also East German grain and so on. How did they pay for that, these imports? Well, basically by producing underweight imitations of the imperial money. So the Dutch Rijksdaalder, they even called it that, like the imperial dollar of the empire, was I think roughly 17% lighter than the imperial dollar, or at least the silver content was 17% less. And obviously, if you pay with money like that, and it looks like the original, it did look like the original. They even faked the design. Then obviously importing food is much easier, and yeah, over time that began to destabilize the imperial currency really, really seriously. First of all, of course, in regions adjacent to the Netherlands, in the Rhineland. We already in the 1570s, in the late 1570s and early 1580s, we find edicts of local authorities in the Rhineland warning the population against Dutch money. But by the beginning of the second decade of the 17th century, the system really was already spinning out of control. And then, of course, the 30 Years' War began with the debasement that was triggered by the Habsburg conquest of Bohemia. And, common currency was sort of reconstructed after some years, but it never really worked again as well as in the late 16th century. Mm. Yep.
Good evening. Thank you for your lecture. I'm Tom from law school. May I ask how the Charles V currency policy, monetary policy, and the common currency policy are secured by the law at that time? What kind of lessons will be taught for today's monetary policy? Thank you.
Yeah. Well, both the common currency that Charles V tried to introduce at the beginning of the 1550s and the common currency that his younger brother Ferdinand then did introduce some years later were based on sets of extremely complex legislation, probably the most complex legislation that the empire ever passed. If you look at these currency bills, they are very, very long, extremely detailed, extremely technical, difficult to understand, and they are, of course, they had to be that. They were published, so in principle the public did have access to that, and you could buy the text. But given that at most 5% of the population was able to read texts of that complexity, this didn't have much of an effect. In each case, this was cast into law and supposed to be enforced. In the case of Charles V, enforcement didn't work, implementation didn't work. Some years later, under Ferdinand I, it did work, and we just discussed why that was the case. But in each case, it was a legal act that was supposed to implement the currency, to create the currency. Mm-hmm.
Hello, my name is Andreas. I'm a postgrad student in economic history at LSE. So you spoke about how Charles V was persistent on adopting a floating rate on the common currency, but then when you are asked by Professor Olivier, you said how the silver exchange rate was actually really stable, which is weird from in a decentralized market. So my actual question was, what was the actual advantage of adopting a floating rate? Mm. And whether or not Charles V predicted that the floating rate would actually change or the currency will remain stable?
Yeah, I think I probably wasn't really clear about this issue. So Charles V was actually in favor of a bimetallic currency where the rate of gold and silver was legally fixed once and for all. That's what he wanted. So what he observed is that gold was becoming steadily more expensive. Gold was appreciating due to the large output of the imperial silver mines. And the imports of gold didn't keep pace, so gold in terms of silver became increasingly more expensive, more valuable. And Charles V, of course, was deeply indebted to firms like the Fuggers and others. And many of these debts, a large share of these debts were denominated in gold. So he wanted a system where the relative value of gold and silver was once and for all fixed, a bimetallic currency, where gold would no longer appreciate. That is why he was interested in that kind of system. His brother gave it up. Ferdinand I implemented a currency where gold and silver were floating. So in that respect, he abandoned bimetallism, but not, because bimetallism is in some way continually, inherently unstable. That's an argument that has been made in other contexts. He abandoned it because basically of the opposition of the electors on the Rhine, who didn't want a bimetallic currency, and he needed to get them on board.
Good. Well, I know there is a question in the back, but unfortunately, we have to end it here. So, you know, the answer is probably in the book, and you'll get an opportunity to purchase a copy at the end. And actually, I think Oliver will be available to sign the copy. So that's. So let me remind you of the reception. You're all very welcome to attend. Let me thank Oliver and Federica for this presentation. I also want to thank Tracy Key for organizing. And we'll see you all at the reception.
Yep, wonderful.
Really fun. Thank you for organizing everything. Running around the mic.
That's what I realised. It's normally two words. And I just realised I was going, oh, I've really got one mic.
Yeah.
That's what it's like. There's only one of me.
Yeah, right.
There's only one mic. And it's like, we're normally one on each
You're doing a
side.
fantastic job.
That's great.
I
Thank
think
you so
we
much.
deserve
You organized all this.
I'm glad we finally done it.
You have to sign your copies.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Olivia, you
It's
are like
not even for you, right?
like a blue enforcer.
Yes. Most important.
Oh, my God, you have my giant
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. So yeah, let's
join the crowd.
Yeah.
That's fine.
So I think that's a decent enough conversation.
Yeah, well, you can tell them that if we don't have that, like, we wouldn't have any events on the PLP if they take these away from us.
Yeah, that's it.
So, like,
Because this one, they wouldn't do this one. Well, no, not that they wouldn't, because they're the first to turn.
yeah, but you can tell them, like, you know, it's reasonable that we would have at least one PLP per year, right? Like, you know, so, like, that doesn't seem.
And the thing is, when you look at the ones that we've been putting on, we consistently make their top five. Moving down there for the meetings.
Yeah, yeah,
Let's go get a drink.
yeah, yeah. Yeah.
Will I see you in the reception?
Yeah, I'm gonna stay for a drink.
Yeah.
And I'm gonna try
You've earned it.
Yeah.
collapse and
We're literally
fix my jet lag.